In the shadow of the Cascade Mountains, where the wilderness meets solitude, 78-year-old Eleanor Morgan has lived a quiet life since losing her husband 15 years ago. Her modest cabin at the edge of Pinecrest has weathered decades of harsh winters, much like Ellie herself. Steady, resilient, and standing firm, unyielding to the passage of time. But her life takes an unexpected turn when 4 orphaned bobcat cubs, trembling and vulnerable, appear on her doorstep. These aren't ordinary kittens. As they grow and their wild instincts emerge, an extraordinary bond forms between them and Ellie. Yet, as the storms outside rage, a far greater tempest brews in Ellie's own life. Now she must summon all her strength, not only to protect her new family, but to face dangers closer and more threatening than she ever imagined. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories.
The small town of Pinecrest, nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was a place where time seemed to move more slowly than in the bustling cities just a few hours' drive away. At the edge of this town, where the asphalt roads gave way to dirt paths and eventually the wilderness, stood a modest cabin that had weathered more than 70 harsh winters. This cabin belonged to Eleanor Morgan, known to most as Miss Ellie. At 78 years old, Ellie had deep smile lines etched around her eyes and silver hair she kept in a practical braid down her back. Her hands bore the marks of decades of hard work, gardening, teaching, and simply surviving in a place where nature could be both beautiful and unforgiving. She had spent 43 years teaching at Pinecrest Elementary, and there wasn't a local family who hadn't had at least one child in her classroom. Ellie hadn't always lived alone. She and her husband, Frank, had built their life in this cabin, raising their daughter Sarah here before she moved away to Seattle to become a doctor. Frank had been gone for almost 15 years now, taken by a heart attack one winter morning while chopping wood. Since then, Ellie had grown accustomed to solitude, finding companionship in her garden, her books, and occasional visits from former students and neighbors. "You really should consider moving into town, Miss Ellie," Michael Jenkins, the local sheriff and one of her former students, would say during his monthly check-ins. "Or at least think about moving closer to Sarah in the city." Ellie would just smile and shake her head. "This is my home, Michael. These mountains know me, and I know them. Besides," she'd add with a twinkle in her eye, "who would keep an eye on all you troublemakers if I left?" What Ellie didn't say was that leaving the cabin would feel like leaving Frank. His presence lingered in the worn wooden floorboards, in the rocking chair on the porch where he'd spent summer evenings, and in the workshop behind the cabin where his tools still hung, waiting for hands that would never return. It was early April when everything changed. The ground was still damp from the last snow melt, but patches of wildflowers had begun to appear, adding splashes of color to the predominantly green and brown landscape. Ellie was in her garden, preparing the soil for her summer vegetables, when she heard the rumble of an approaching truck. The vehicle that pulled up was familiar, a battered green pickup belonging to Jake Thompson, Pinecrest's game warden and another former student of Ellie's. Jake was in his early 40s now, with a weathered face from years spent outdoors and kind eyes that had seen their share of both wonder and tragedy in the wilderness. "Morning, Miss Ellie," Jake called as he climbed out of his truck. Something in his voice caught Ellie's attention, a note of urgency that made her straighten up despite her protesting back. "What brings you out here so early, Jake?" she asked, wiping her soil-covered hands on her gardening apron. Jake reached into the cab of his truck and carefully lifted out a large wooden crate. "Found something I thought you might be able to help with," he said, setting the crate gently on the ground between them. Ellie peered inside and felt her heart constrict. 4 tiny bobcat kittens were huddled together, their spotted fur still fluffy with youth, their eyes a brilliant blue that would eventually turn yellow as they matured. They couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Their mother was hit by a logging truck up on Ridge Road. Jake explained quietly. By the time I got there, she was gone. Found these little ones nearby in a hollow log. Must have heard the commotion and hidden. Poor things, Ellie murmured, reaching in to gently stroke one of the kittens. It hissed weakly, showing tiny teeth in a gesture that was more fear than aggression. What's the plan for them? Jake sighed, removing his worn baseball cap and running a hand through his graying hair. That's the problem. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Portland is overwhelmed right now with the early spring. They can't take them for at least 2 weeks, and I can't keep them at my place with my dogs. And you thought of me. Ellie finished for him, looking up with knowing eyes. Jake had the grace to look sheepish. You've always had a way with animals, Miss Ellie. And I remember how you rehabilitated that injured hawk when I was in your class. These little ones need someone who can feed them every few hours, keep them warm, and not get too attached. He paused, then added, it would just be temporary. Once they're weaned, they'll go to the rehabilitation center to learn how to survive in the wild. Ellie looked back at the kittens. They were so small, so vulnerable. Without their mother, their chances of survival were virtually zero. She thought about her empty cabin, the quiet evenings, and the space in her life that had never quite been filled since Frank passed. Well, she said finally, I suppose my garden can wait a bit. Let's get these little ones inside. And that was how Eleanor Morgan, retired schoolteacher and widow, became the surrogate mother to 4 orphan bobcat kittens. The first few days were a crash course in wild animal care. Jake brought over special formula from the veterinary clinic in town, along with syringes for feeding, heating pads, and a book on wildlife rehabilitation. He also brought a stern warning. Remember, Miss Ellie, these aren't house cats. They're wild animals. The goal is to keep them healthy, but not domesticated. They need to be able to return to the wild eventually. Ellie nodded seriously, but inside she was already falling in love with the 4 tiny creatures who depended on her so completely. She named them, despite Jake's warnings not to. The largest male she called Rusty for his reddish fur. The smallest, most vocal female became Scout. The curious male who was always exploring became Ranger, and the cautious female who watched everything with calculating eyes became Shadow. Every 3 hours, even throughout the night, Ellie would prepare their formula and carefully feed each kitten with the syringe. She cleaned them with a warm, damp cloth after each feeding, mimicking their mother's tongue. She provided them with a box lined with soft blankets and heating pads, creating a safe den in her spare bedroom. As the weeks passed, the kittens grew stronger. Their eyes, which had been that startling blue, gradually changed to a golden yellow. Their baby fur gave way to the more distinctive coat of juvenile bobcats. They became more active, more curious, and considerably more destructive. You should see what they did to my throw pillows, Ellie told Sarah during one of their weekly phone calls. Looked like it had snowed stuffing in my living room. Mom, Sarah's voice was concerned over the line. Are you sure this is safe? Bobcats are wild animals. They could hurt you once they get bigger. Nonsense, Ellie replied, watching as Ranger stalked and pounced on a toy mouse she'd given them. They know me. I'm the hand that feeds them. But as the kittens grew, Ellie knew Sarah had a point. They were getting larger, stronger, their play becoming rougher. When Jake visited after a month, he was impressed by how healthy they looked, but concerned by how comfortable they seemed around humans. They should be showing more wariness, he said, watching as Scout batted at his shoelaces. We need to start thinking about transitioning them to the rehabilitation center. Ellie felt a pang at the thought of giving them up, but nodded agreement. They need to learn to be wild, she acknowledged. But they're still so young. Jake studied her face, then made a decision. Let's compromise. We'll build an outdoor enclosure here, something that gives them more space and exposure to the natural environment, but keeps them contained. You can start reducing your interaction with them, and we'll gradually prepare them for the move to the center. With the help of Jake and a few other community members, all sworn to secrecy about the unusual residence at Miss Ellie's cabin. A large enclosure was built adjacent to the cabin. It included branches for climbing, hiding places, and natural substrate. The bobcats were moved outside, and Ellie began the difficult process of creating distance between herself and the animals she had nurtured. She still prepared their food, but now it consisted of whole prey items. Mice and rats from the pet store at first, then rabbits as they grew larger. She began wearing a mask when she entered the enclosure to prevent them from associating human faces with food. She reduced her time with them, watching from the cabin window as they explored their new territory, played with each other, and developed the skills they would need for survival. But sometimes, in the quiet evenings, she would sit on a chair near their enclosure and read aloud from whatever book she was enjoying. The bobcats would often pause in their activities to watch her, especially Rusty, who would sometimes lie near the fence, seemingly listening to her voice. "I know," she would tell them with a sad smile. "I'm breaking all the rules. But an old woman gets lonely, and you four are good company." Summer came to the Cascades, bringing longer days and warmer temperatures. The bobcats were now adolescents, nearly the size of house cats, but more muscular, with distinctive tufted ears and stubby tails. According to the plan, they should have gone to the rehabilitation center by now, but a series of circumstances, staffing shortages, space issues, and then a forest fire that displaced other wildlife, kept delaying their transfer. "It's not ideal," Jake admitted during one of his visits. "They're getting older, and the longer they stay here, the harder it might be for them to adjust to a fully wild existence." But Ellie could see that the bobcats were already showing more wild behaviors. They were becoming more nocturnal, more secretive. They would hide when strangers came to the property, and they had begun hunting live prey that entered their enclosure: chipmunks, birds, and even a squirrel that had made the mistake of investigating their space. One evening in late July, as Ellie was bringing their dinner, a rabbit for each of them, she noticed something unusual. The latch on the enclosure door was loose, apparently damaged by a recent thunderstorm or perhaps by the growing strength of the bobcats themselves. Her heart sank as she realized the implication: the bobcats could escape. She stood frozen for a moment, then carefully secured the food inside and fixed the latch as best she could. Back in the cabin, she called Jake immediately. "I'll come first thing tomorrow with proper repair materials," he promised. "Do you want me to come now? I could be there in an hour." Ellie looked out the window at the enclosure. The bobcats were eating their dinner, showing no signs of having discovered their potential freedom. "No, I think it'll hold until morning." They seemed settled. That night, Ellie slept fitfully, waking several times to look out the window with her flashlight, checking that the enclosure was still occupied. By dawn, she was already on her porch with a cup of coffee, watching the bobcats sleep in a pile in one corner of their space. Jake arrived as promised, and together they reinforced the enclosure, making it more secure than before. But the incident had made both of them realize something important. "It's time, isn't it?" Ellie said quietly as they finished the repairs. Jake nodded, his expression sympathetic. "They're ready, Miss Ellie. The rehabilitation center has space now, and these four need to complete their journey back to the wild." Ellie knew he was right. The bobcats had grown so much, not just in size, but in their behaviors and instincts. They were less interested in her presence now, more focused on their own world of scents, sounds, and prey movements. They were becoming what they were always meant to be: wild predators. 3 days later, Jake arrived with transport crates and 2 assistants from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The process of capturing the bobcats was stressful for everyone involved. Despite being raised by humans, the cats were now wary enough to resist being handled. It took hours to safely secure all 4 in separate crates. As the last one, Rusty, was loaded into Jake's truck, Ellie felt tears welling in her eyes. She reached out to touch the crate, and Rusty hissed from inside, no longer the dependent kitten she had bottle-fed through the night. "It's okay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. This is how it should be. Jake put an arm around her shoulders. You did good, Miss Ellie. You gave them a chance at life when they had none. Now they'll have a chance at freedom too. Ellie nodded, unable to speak as she watched the truck drive away, carrying with it 4 pieces of her heart. Autumn came to the Cascades, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Ellie's garden had yielded its harvest, and she was busy canning tomatoes and making apple butter from the small orchard behind her cabin. The days were growing shorter, the nights cooler. Soon winter would arrive with its blanket of snow and long, quiet evenings. Jake visited occasionally, bringing updates from the rehabilitation center. The bobcats were doing well, growing into their adult size and showing appropriate wild behaviors. They were being kept together as a sibling group, which was unusual but seemed to be working for them. The plan was to release them in the national forest, about 20 miles from Pinecrest, once they were fully ready. The staff says they've never seen bobcats quite like these 4, Jake told her over coffee one morning. They're more bonded to each other than typical siblings would be at this age. They hunt cooperatively, which isn't common for bobcats. Ellie smiled, feeling a surge of pride. They had to depend on each other from the beginning, she said. And they had a human mother who read them too much Jack London. Perhaps they learned something about pack behavior. Life settled into its familiar rhythm for Ellie. She joined the local senior center's book club, continued her tradition of baking cookies for the elementary school's fundraisers, and prepared her cabin for the coming winter. She tried not to think too much about the bobcats, though their memory lived on in the empty enclosure behind her cabin, which she couldn't bring herself to dismantle. It was the first snow of the season, a light dusting that transformed the landscape overnight, when Ellie received the call from the rehabilitation center. The bobcats had been released the previous day in a remote area of the national forest. The release had gone well, all 4 animals heading into the forest together after a brief hesitation at the open doors of their transport crates. They're truly wild now, Miss Ellie, Jake told her gently. They'll find their territory, and with luck, they'll live long, natural lives. Ellie thanked him for letting her know, then sat on her porch swing, wrapped in a thick blanket, watching the snow fall. She felt a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. The bobcats had been a bright spot in her life, a purpose when she had begun to feel that her useful years were behind her. But they were where they belonged now, and that knowledge warmed her heart despite the chill in the air. Winter deepened, bringing the isolation that heavy snow created in mountain communities. Roads were sometimes impassable for days, and Ellie stocked her pantry accordingly, prepared for periods when she might be effectively cut off from town. It was during one such snowstorm, 3 weeks before Christmas, that trouble came to Ellie's cabin. The day had faded into an early dusk, and the wind howled around the eaves of the old building. Ellie had built up the fire in her wood stove and settled in with a book and a cup of tea when she heard the sound of a vehicle struggling up her driveway. Curious, she went to the window. Through the swirling snow, she could make out the shape of an unfamiliar pickup truck. Not Jake's, and not anyone else's she recognized immediately. Pinecrest was a small town, and Ellie knew most vehicles by sight. The truck stopped, and 2 men emerged, bundled against the cold. They trudged toward her porch, and Ellie felt a flicker of unease. Visitors were rare enough in good weather. In a snowstorm, they were highly unusual unless it was an emergency. Still, years of small-town living had ingrained certain hospitality reflexes. She opened the door as they reached the porch steps. "Can I help you?" she called over the wind. The men looked up, and something in their expressions made Ellie's unease deepen. They didn't have the open faces of neighbors or the concerned look of people seeking help. "Ms. Morgan?" the taller one asked. He was middle-aged, with a scraggly beard and eyes that darted past her into the cabin. "We're with the power company. Got a report of lines down in this area. Mind if we come in and use your phone? Our radio's out." Ellie knew it was a lie immediately. The power was still on in her cabin, for one thing. For another, Utility workers would have proper identification and vehicles with logos, and they'd have used her surname, not addressed her as Ms. Morgan, like someone who had learned her name secondhand. "I'm afraid my phone line is down," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Has been since yesterday. You might try the Hendersons, about 2 miles back down the road. They have satellite phones for emergencies." The shorter man stepped forward. He had a lean, hungry look about him. "Look, lady, it's freezing out here. Just let us in for a minute to warm up." Ellie's hand tightened on the doorknob. "I'm sorry, but I don't know you, and I don't let strangers into my home. There's a community shelter in town if you need warmth." The taller man's face hardened. "I don't think you understand the situation." His hand moved to his jacket pocket, and Ellie caught the unmistakable outline of a gun. "We're coming in, one way or another." Fear surged through Ellie, but decades of handling unruly fourth graders had taught her something about not showing weakness. "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice remarkably calm. "And I should tell you that Sheriff Jenkins checks on me daily in this weather. He's due any minute now." It was another lie. Michael only came by weekly, and he'd visited just yesterday, but she hoped it might give them pause. The shorter man laughed. "Nice try, old woman. We know the sheriff's stuck in town with a multi-car pileup on the highway. No one's coming to check on you tonight." Ellie's blood ran cold. They'd done their homework. These weren't opportunistic drifters. They had targeted her specifically. Her mind raced to the rumors she'd heard in town recently about break-ins at remote homes, particularly those belonging to elderly residents who might have valuables or medications. "What do you want?" she asked, stalling for time as she tried to think of options. Her phone was in the kitchen. Her late husband's shotgun was locked in a cabinet in the bedroom, unloaded, with ammunition stored separately, as she'd been taught. Neither was within quick reach. "We'll start with whatever cash you have," the taller man said. "Then maybe some of those nice antiques I can see from here. And we know old folks like you usually have good prescription meds." As he spoke, he pushed forward, forcing Ellie to step back into her own home. The shorter man followed, closing the door behind them and immediately beginning to scan the room for valuables. "The cash is in a jar in the kitchen cupboard," Ellie said, hoping compliance might keep the situation from escalating. "I don't have much, just emergency money." "Show me," the taller man ordered, gesturing with the gun now openly in his hand. Ellie led the way to the kitchen, her mind still frantically searching for a way out of this nightmare. As they passed the back door that led to her garden and the now empty Bobcat enclosure beyond, she noticed it wasn't fully latched. Had she left it that way after bringing in firewood earlier? It might offer an escape route if she could create a diversion. In the kitchen, she slowly reached for a cabinet, opening it to reveal a row of canning jars. "It's in one of these," she said, her hands shaking now not entirely from fear, but with the beginnings of a plan. The man stepped closer, impatient. "Hurry up, Grandma. We don't have all night." As Ellie reached for a jar on the top shelf, she deliberately knocked several others off, sending them crashing to the floor in an explosion of glass and preserved tomatoes. In the moment of startled confusion, she bolted for the back door, throwing it open and running into the snowy darkness. She heard cursing behind her, then the sound of pursuit. At 78, Ellie was no match for younger men in a foot race, especially in deep snow. Her only hope was to reach the shed behind the cabin, which had a lock on the inside and a window she might be able to climb through to circle back to her truck. She was halfway to the shed when her foot caught on a hidden root, sending her sprawling face first into the snow. Pain shot through her ankle as she tried to stand. Not broken, she thought, but definitely sprained. Behind her, flashlight beams cut through the darkness as both men emerged from the cabin. "You're only making this worse for yourself," the taller one called, his voice tight with anger. Ellie tried to crawl toward the shed, but the pain in her ankle and the deep snow made progress almost impossible. The men's footsteps crunched closer in the snow. This was it, she thought. After all these years of independence, of proving she could manage on her own, she was going to fall victim to the very scenario Sarah and Michael had warned her about. Then she heard something else, a low, rumbling growl from the darkness to her right. The sound was primal, raising the hairs on the back of her neck despite the dire situation with her human pursuers. The men heard it too. Their flashlight beams swung wildly toward the sound. "What the hell was that?" the shorter man asked, his voice suddenly uncertain. Before anyone could answer, a blur of motion erupted from the shadows. Something large and fast slammed into the shorter man, knocking him off his feet with a cry of shock and pain. In the chaotic swinging of the remaining flashlight, Ellie caught glimpses of a tawny spotted coat and powerful limbs. A bobcat. Not just any bobcat. It was large, adult-sized. And it wasn't alone. 3 more shapes materialized from the darkness, circling the men with threatening growls. The taller man fired his gun wildly, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the scene in stark detail. For adult bobcats, positioned strategically around the humans, their eyes reflecting the light like golden lamps. "Jesus Christ," he shouted, firing again and backing toward the cabin. "Get these things away from us." The shorter man was struggling to his feet, his arm bleeding from what appeared to be claw marks. "Let's get out of here," he yelled, abandoning any thought of robbery in the face of this unexpected threat. Both men retreated hastily toward their truck, one firing another warning shot that went wide, the other stumbling and slipping in his panic. The bobcats followed, not attacking directly now, but keeping the pressure on, ensuring the retreat continued. Ellie watched in stunned disbelief as the men climbed into their truck. The engine roared to life, and they backed down her driveway at dangerous speed, nearly colliding with a tree before disappearing into the snowy night. Silence fell, broken only by the wind and the soft padding of paws and snow. Ellie became acutely aware of her vulnerable position, lying injured in the cold. The bobcats had chased off the intruders, but they were wild predators themselves. Would they now see her as prey? Slowly, cautiously, she pushed herself to a sitting position. Her ankle throbbed, and she was beginning to feel the cold seeping through her clothes. The bobcats had gathered a short distance away, watching her with inscrutable yellow eyes. "Well," she said aloud, her voice shaking slightly, "I suppose I should thank you, whoever you are." One of the bobcats stepped forward, the largest male, with distinctive markings that stirred something in Ellie's memory. He approached slowly, stopping just a few feet away from her. He sniffed the air, then made a chuffing sound that seemed almost like recognition. "Rusty," Ellie whispered, hardly daring to hope. "Is that you, boy?" The bobcat tilted his head, and in that moment, despite all logic and wildlife biology, Ellie was certain. These weren't just any bobcats. These were her bobcats, Rusty, Scout, Ranger, and Shadow. Somehow, they had found their way back to the place where they had been raised, to the human who had saved them when they were helpless kittens. "You impossible creatures," she said, tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold air. "You're supposed to be 20 miles away in the national forest." Rusty took another step closer, then another, until he was near enough that Ellie could feel the heat radiating from his body. He sniffed her outstretched hand, then turned and made a sound to the others. To Ellie's amazement, they formed a loose circle around her, their bodies creating a windbreak against the driving snow. Understanding dawned on her. They weren't going to harm her. Somehow, against all odds and expert predictions, these wild animals remembered her. More than that, they were protecting her. Emboldened, Ellie spoke again. "I need to get back to the cabin," she said, as if they could understand. "My ankles hurt." She began the painful process of standing, using a nearby tree for support. The bobcats watched, alert but not interfering. Once she was upright, balancing on her good foot, she began to hop awkwardly toward the cabin, using trees and shrubs for balance where she could. The bobcats moved with her, staying close but not touching, maintaining their protective formation. It was slow progress through the deepening snow, but eventually, Ellie reached her back porch. The steps presented a challenge with her injured ankle, but she managed to pull herself up using the railing. At the door, she paused and looked back. The 4 bobcats sat in the snow, watching her. They made no move to follow her inside, seeming to understand that the human dwelling wasn't their territory. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved my life tonight." She hobbled inside to call the sheriff and report the attempted robbery. As she waited for help to arrive, she kept glancing out the window, expecting the bobcats to disappear back into the forest. But they remained, settled in the snow around her cabin like sentinels. When Sheriff Michael Jenkins finally arrived the next morning, having battled through snow-blocked roads with a deputy and the town doctor, he found Ellie safe in her cabin with a wrapped ankle and an incredible story to tell. "Bobcats," he repeated skeptically after Ellie had recounted the previous night's events. "You're saying 4 bobcats chased off armed robbers?" "I know how it sounds," Ellie admitted. "But I'm not senile yet, Michael. Look at the tracks in the snow if you don't believe me." The sheriff and his deputy did investigate the area around the cabin and found evidence supporting Ellie's story. Footprints of 2 men running back to where tire tracks showed a vehicle had been parked, and unmistakable bobcat tracks circling the area. They also found blood in the snow that didn't belong to Ellie, supporting her claim that one of the men had been clawed. "I'll be damned," Michael said when he returned inside. "But why would wild bobcats defend a human? It goes against everything we know about their behavior." Ellie exchanged a glance with Jake, who had arrived after hearing about the incident on the police radio. They had never fully explained to the community what had been happening at Ellie's cabin the previous spring and summer. "Maybe they weren't entirely wild," Jake suggested carefully. Over coffee, they explained the full story to the sheriff. How Ellie had raised the orphan bobcats, how they had been rehabilitated and released into the wild, and how, against all odds, they appeared to have found their way back to the place they associated with safety and care. "They remembered you," Michael said wonderingly. "After all these months in the wild, they remembered the human who saved them, and they returned the favor." "It seems that way," Ellie agreed. "Though any wildlife biologist would tell you it's impossible." "Well, I've lived in these mountains my whole life," Michael said, "and I've learned that impossible is just a word people use when they can't explain something." In the days that followed, as news of the incident spread through Pinecrest, people began to report occasional sightings of bobcats near Ellie's property. They never approached other humans and fled if anyone tried to get close, but they remained in the vicinity, establishing a territory that happened to include the cabin of a certain elderly schoolteacher. As for Ellie, she finally agreed to Sarah's repeated suggestion to install a security system, though she insisted with a smile that she already had the best protection any mountain resident could ask for. She also adopted a large dog from the county shelter, not for protection, she claimed, but for company. The bobcats seemed to accept the dog's presence with cautious tolerance, perhaps understanding that it was part of Ellie's family group. When spring returned to the Cascades, bringing with it new wildflowers and longer days, Ellie would often sit on her porch in the evenings with her dog at her feet. Sometimes, as twilight settled over the mountains, she would glimpse shapes moving at the edge of the forest, 4 bobcats, going about their wild lives, but never straying too far from the cabin where they had once been given a second chance at life. And on particularly quiet nights, when the wind was still and the moon was bright, Ellie would read aloud from whatever book she was enjoying, her voice carrying across her garden to the listening wilderness beyond. Whether the bobcats understood the words didn't matter. What mattered was the connection, an unlikely bond between species that transcended the usual boundaries between wild and tame, between giving and receiving protection. In a world that often emphasized the divisions between humans and the natural world, Ellie and her bobcats had found something rare and precious, a circle of care that flowed both ways, proof that kindness, once offered freely, sometimes returns when it's needed most.